welcome you all to the 14th Annual Charity Research Symposium. To begin with, I'd like to take a few minutes very few minutes to talk about sort of why we're here, if you like. It was in 2005, and actually in spring 2006, that David Sheridan invested in the school to the tune of $25 million as an investment to support graduate student fellowships, to support faculty research fellowships, and to support two endowed chairs. And every fall since then, which has turned into this annual event that gets ever more people, we have had an annual symposium to bring forward some of the researchers, both the faculty researchers and the student researchers, in sort of a celebration both of the investment, but also of the school as a whole. And I think this has turned into a wonderful event, which we're here for now. So we're pleased to welcome David and Kusun back to the University of Waterloo for what is actually their 14th visit since then, to come every year to this, and it's been a great thing. And for those of you who are graduate students in the audience, please be ready for some intense investigation into what you've been doing. Just saying. This has been a really exciting time in the school over the past, I can say over my tenure as director. And given that this is the last time I will be doing this, I can reflect a little bit. Many of you were not here in 2006, and the school really has profoundly changed. I mean, if I look back in the last 6 years, we've hired more than 25 professorial faculty in the school. This is the first year of the endowed time of the David R. Sheridan School of Computer Science that we in fact have two chairs. I think are in the audience. 1, 2. So, thank you. They have both been hyperactive over the past few years and over the past few months in establishing their presence in the school. We now have more than 400 graduate students, which is also a very large increase that goes with the increased complement of professorial faculty and researchers. And when you walk down the halls, you sort of feel the vibrancy and the youth that I guess I do appreciate now. And I feel that this every day it's an exciting place, and that is what we're striving for, and I think this is a great chance to celebrate it. Today we have two Sheridan faculty fellows who will be presenting their research. It's research that is involved with the graduate students here, and it's taking two completely different directions. And so I'm excited to hear the talks. There are posters to come later. There's in the afternoon, there is a free lunch. So please, there is a free lunch. We're shy. There is a free lunch. And so I encourage you all to attend the talks and to go to the posters and see what people are doing in the school. And following it up, there is gelato, is what I understand, at 4 p.m. and prizes. Not for you unless you win one of the poster contests. So, okay, with that, again, welcome to David and Kusun, welcome to all of you, and I'd like to introduce Dan Brown as our first Sheridan Fellow speaker. So Dan's been a faculty member here since, I believe, 2000. He graduated with his undergrad from MIT and his PhD from Cornell, 2000, and it was not on this topic. Not at all. He started as someone doing computational biology about a year after I did here, and still maintains that research program. His research has clearly taken a bifurcation. I believe both things are happening at the same time, but for this talk, so when you ask him, you don't know what you're going to get. What we get is good poetry, which I won't attempt to mangle any further. So thank you, Dan.
Great. You have the mic?
I do.
If I sit there, then we'll hear about you. Congratulations. Hear you. Okay. So being microphones is not a beautiful thing. So at all. So hopefully making sure that this is okay. Is this okay then? Great. All right, thanks, Mark. Yeah, it is true. Anytime you get a talk from me, you don't know what you're getting. A couple years ago, I went to the University of Rochester and gave a talk about rap music and poetry, and then a talk about evolutionary tree reconstruction, and they really didn't know what to do with me. And so maybe you folks do. I want to start off with a couple of thank yous. The first one is genuinely a thank you to David Sheridan for this donation that turned into this fellowship. As all of you know in this room, I've been doing a lot of admin work for the last 5 or 10 years, and it's nice to actually have the time to have a research program too. It's not what I would dream of if I were not also doing a lot of admin work. But the freedom of time that this is really important, so thank you. I also want to say, I probably should have given this talk a year ago. I'm no longer a Sheridan Fellow, but a year ago I had Mark's talk. And so consequently I did not give this talk then. This is joint work with my recently graduated PhD student, Carolyn Lamb, and with Charlie. Charlie was away on Facebook for a chunk of this, so much of this work was just Carolyn and me, but Charlie provided a lot of the inspiration and also is often the right person in the room when you're not quite sure you've got a good result to say, damn it, this is a great result. So thank you to both of them. I want to start off with some good poetry. Assuming we can actually, there we go. I want to start off with some good poetry because we're going to have some real thumpers in this talk. Blessed Cecilia, come down, appear in visions to all musicians, appear and aspire. Translated daughter, come down and startle, composing mortals with immortal fire. So that is, I hope we can agree that's pretty good. That's W.H. Auden. It's the lyric for the chorus of Benjamin Britten's hymn to St. Cecilia. And part of the reason why I want to start with this poem is because I want to tell you a little bit, and there's a lot, about the story of this poem. Auden and Britten were in America at the beginning of World War II. They didn't like each other very much. Britten notoriously had collaborators that he stopped working with, and people called them his corpses. The two of them wrote this together. It's a hymn to St. Cecilia. She's the patron saint for musicians and composers. And if you look at it, it asks, it's also relevant to the topic of this talk because it asks St. Cecilia to come down and inspire a composing mortal with immortal fire of creation. We might not think in those kinds of terms, but it's good to at least have that joy at the beginning of this talk. I give a lot of talks at a lot of different places, and I usually start off with a slide that asks, who am I? Hopefully you all know, but just for fun, I have 3 different photos of me from 3 very, very different times in my life. The former is right before you all met me, and the last is actually a press photo from about a year and a half ago. I also work on too many things of different sorts, as Mark sort of implied. If you get bored during this talk and want to know why I do this, just search for my name and the phrase freedom to wander, and you'll get a 900-word essay I wrote for Shannon Day's blog on academic freedom about why I do this But here we're going to talk about computational creativity and the idea of computers generating creative artifacts. So let's start off with a definition of what I mean by computational creativity. It's computers generating artifacts that if they had been generated by human beings, we would say they were creative. Now that's a sort of unsatisfying definition, but most definitions of philosophical concepts are. This is an adaptation of a definition by Garth Wiggins and Simon Colton. It sweeps a lot of things under the rug. Who's doing the perceiving of the artifact? When are they looking at it? Like, does it matter? Does an object that was once creative 100 years ago still carry its creativeness now? What kind of artifacts are we looking at in the first place? But it fundamentally also ignores the question or hides the question of what does it mean to be creative in the first place. And so we're going to spend some time in this talk, in addition to talking about poetry and talking about computers making poetry, just talking about creativity and the question of good poetry in the first place. Some examples of this movement of computational creativity is sort of situated at the corner of AI, although the people who find their way into it find their way from a variety of different directions. I came into it from the work I was doing on music information retrieval. Other people actually come into it because they generate automatic theorem provers, and they want to see whether there's creativity in the theorems or proofs that those programs produce. Still others study things like scientific creativity. But I want to give you some examples of programs in this domain and respected people in it. And so I want to start off with video games, which is an art form that I think is under-recognized for how important it is and how valuable it is. And I mean, we have examples in the school of people who work on the graphics in video games. I'm looking at Chris right now, but there are certainly others. But this is a different sort of creativity. Mike Cook, who's a researcher, an English researcher, has a system called Angelina that develops platformer games or other kinds of video games, and it generates levels, it assesses the quality of its own work, it tries to highlight specific goals in its creation. It goes a little bit further than that. It also, in the most recent version of the system, it coordinates a team of designers, some of whom are human beings and some of whom are other computer agents, to the extent that it actually, he envisions, I don't think he's yet done this, he's had it hire people. I don't think he's yet had it fire people. But if you think about it, the idea isn't completely nutty. And so that's an example of a video game development system that has specific goals, is working towards specific ends, responds to user inputs, but also does other tasks in the creative process besides just generating. There's lots of examples of this in the visual art space, particularly in the last couple of years. Here's a Globe and Mail headline of a system that generates images and then does a reverse Google image search on the image it generates, and then if they're sufficiently similar to other images, then it calls them an homage to that thing that it didn't know about when it was creating the image in the first place, and then tries to sell it. So that got some lawsuits. Meanwhile, Christie's about a year ago sold a painting, and there's been other examples of this since then. If you look at it, it's kind of weird looking, but sold a painting that was generated by an AI for a few $100,000. And there have been other examples of this in the intervening period. I mean, people will buy anything, like, so, and at the level of this being a piece of conceptual art, as much as a piece of a painting, whatever. In the actual computational creativity domain, Simon Colton and his co-authors in England have this system called the Painting Fool, and it responds to news that it, I think, accumulates through reading things like The Guardian and other newspapers, and then it generates and is inspired to create, or claims to be, new artifacts, new paintings, based on not just what's in the news, but how it, in quotation mark, feels about what was in the news as well. And Simon has also sold paintings, probably for quite a bit less than $432,000, but Simon has also sold paintings that have resulted from the Painting Fool. I mean, I feel like I can't say this here without citing a domestic example. Craig Kaplan, about 10 years ago, had a master's student, Alex Kalajian, who generated a system that simulated Bob Ross. Everybody knows who Bob Ross is. And don't please look, because it's such a joy of the day to watch Bob Ross videos. And in fact, at Alex's master's thesis presentation, Dan Barry bought the painting that was demonstrated during the thesis presentation. So we even had examples of people buying automatically generated art on campus. Further, with some Waterloo examples, there's a lot of work in the last while on computationally generated music. And I'm going to quickly play you a bit from this project. So there's a system called Elysia that was started by Maya Ackerman and Dave Locher, who both got their degrees here at Waterloo. They were shy students. And bad as pop music, right? I mean, that's pop music. It has a chorus, it has a consistent set of lyrics, and I believe the singer in this case is actually Maya herself. It certainly is on that first song I started off with, which I don't like. It makes the lyrics, it makes the music, it tries to tie them in with each other. This is now an app that you can download in the App Store on Apple and on Google. And people are actually now using this to write love songs for their significant others online using that. Because people aren't as creative as they might like to be. In general, this whole domain is full of a whole bunch of other problems. I mean, because of this being this generation of the AI revolution, we're constantly seeing one more example after another of things that we might think were creative in a whole bunch of different domains. I'm giving you some artistic examples here. This is always called, over time, what happens is that we say, oh, well, that wasn't really a creative task, but that wasn't really hard. And that's sometimes called moving the goalposts, or the AI effect is, I think, how Kate often talks about it, which I think is coming from the literature and generally AI literature. I'm going to talk today about poetry. And some of these domains seem to be easy, and some of these domains seem to be hard. And it's a natural question whether poetry should be in the easy category or the hard category. And there's arguments on both sides of that. An advantage that poetry has that, say, music doesn't is we're used to. We don't tend to consume much poetry, but we're kind of used to the idea that in 2019, poetry is weird and experimental and funky. And so if what we got from a computer were weird and experimental and funky, we might be okay with that. A similar thing that actually works from the opposite perspective that also makes this a little potentially easy is that poetry is highly structured and specified. You know, if I tell you I'm making a sonnet, you kind of know what I'm going to make. And those are algorithmic statements I can make to a computer to follow. On the other hand, good poetry has a lot of things that are actually pretty hard. It has meaning. People don't like poems about nothing. If you read a poem and at the end of it you're like, but there's that wasn't anything. That's not very satisfying. It really needs to have an emotional center. It needs to be about something. And then there's a problem that poetry has, which music doesn't have, which is that you immediately focus on where the mistakes are. So if I play for you a piece of pop music and it has one wrong note in it, you'll just kind of ignore it. As long as it's okay, you might at the end of it say, you should fix that. But that would be all you would do. Whereas a poem that's got a flaw in it, especially if it's a structural flaw, you're just going to say, oh, these people are incompetent. And so that's a difference that sort of, it's nothing about poetry and everything about how we interact with poetry, although of course that is what poetry is. We did write a survey about this topic, so if you want more there, I'm happy to point you to that. I'll give you some examples of where the state of the art of the field is, although I'm actually not going to give you the state of the art for a reason I'll come to in a minute. So this is a poem by a system generated by Russ Goodwin, and I want to encourage you to just read this to yourself. I actually think this is one of the classic examples of genuinely moving the bar forward a lot, as so often happens in AI. So that's from 2016, and I'm not going to talk very much about the machine learning, or in fact, I'm not going to talk at all about the machine learning techniques that are inside of that. But the thing that's important that makes this not bad, I would say, is you do have a sense of coherence. There is a sense of a milieu of creepiness and uncomfortableness, the sort of ugliness of Brooklyn contrasted with the frozen wood. There's something there, maybe. If you look in the last just in the last few months, there have been some systems that use extraordinarily large natural language models to generate things that are actually quite a bit better than this. Although it's a little bit awkward because the corpora that they're working from are so huge that a lot of what they're actually doing is almost overlearning from the environment that they're in while they're trying to model a style. On the other hand, the results are astonishing. Here's another example that's from a very, very different perspective. This is a constraint satisfaction system. It's written in Common Lisp. It's that sort of nice 80s style AI, still generating things that are pretty awesome. This is a system called Inkwell. Gabriel actually generated a bunch of poems using this system and took them to a writer's workshop and workshopped them. And the people at the system, at the workshop really enjoyed the experience of interacting with his work. and then were extraordinarily pissed off when he told them that the program, or the poems that they were reading and workshopping together had actually been written by a computer. Oh wow. This particular poem here, which I like a lot, is probably my favorite from the set he had in his paper, is modeling. Each of these is modeling a different poet's style, and this one is ostensibly modeling Whitman, which I don't think is true, but there's still something there. Much more of the norm is probably this, which, you know, you're starting to lose a lot. There's a concept here. The concept here is supposed to be faithfulness. I mean, from the topic, you get some last sentences for, this is a stanza from a sonnet, so you get the last words, and then it fills in the stuff before that, and yeah. So there's something much less satisfying is perhaps this one. Which just, this is the sort of thing that if I asked my 135 students to write, I would hope that they could at least do something on the order of this, but this is, there's rhyme and there's meter and there's parts of speech that are sort of modeled after an existing limerick, but it isn't very great. So, what's going on here? Why is this problem hard? Even in the, and I want to say, even in the case of something like this Ingwell system, or this poem by Russ Goodwin system, or this poem by Ingwell, they're not fantastic. Why is this problem hard? Well, basically, this problem is hard because there's a lot of stuff that a poem is supposed to do, and those are hard things to do. And also, there's not a lot of space in which to do it. So again, I mean, a piece of poetry is a short little bit. It's not, you know, let's write a very large thing and maybe parts of it are good and parts of it are bad. Those haiku only have the appropriate 17 syllables. So there's a lot of stuff that has to happen. And in particular, there are desiderata here that are pretty hard. I mean, we have people in the school who work on these desiderata, but being emotionally salient, using effective imagery, these aren't super easy things for AI systems to do, even now in 2019. So that's the first step. But the other thing that's problematic here is just even, are these systems going in the direction of creative AI? Are they actually generating computationally creative work? We need to step back a little bit. So I want to stop for a second and ask just the general question, what does creative mean? With this idea of generating systems that are actually going to generate artifacts that we would see as creative, what are the kinds of things, what would you be looking for? If a system of this sort existed, when would you know that it was successful or not successful? What would you imagine to be looking for? And I genuinely do mean the audience participation thing here. Yeah.
So I think one thing that a good poem does is to resonate with a wide range of individuals in a given audience.
Okay, so David Matthews is saying one of the things we want to focus here on is the audience of the poem. That it's, I'm sort of presenting some artifacts at you and saying like it or don't like it, but the point of the exercise is actually what do human beings interacting with the artifacts feel or about those. And also he made the comment that it needs a wide audience, but let's say in general some audience specificity is important there. Yuri.
Well, would the word creative mean that's somehow different from the style of previous poets or other poets?
Sure. So that's
different.
So Yuri Boykov is saying what we need to focus on is novelty. That's the way that this comes into this language. But certainly some sense of I don't. When we think about the really creative things in our lives, there are things that either we've never seen before, or in fact no one has ever seen. Good. Other thoughts? Yeah. Evokes an emotional response. So that again goes back to this comment about like focusing on the audience. It's on the audience, not the artifact. Yeah. These are some good answers. Yeah, Byron.
Well, I think the huge problem here is the subjectivity of it. I didn't have a positive emotional response to any of the poems.
You like the audience?
No.
Okay.
I like the music. I don't particularly like the poetry.
Okay.
But that's reflective of, you know, I don't have positive emotional responses for many poems at all. And I'm highly suspect of people, probably based on my grade 11 English teacher, that this is great literature. Totally. What? What's the metric here?
Absolutely. Okay. So that little Jeremiah is a very appropriate one, which comes to the question of why do we declare things to be outstanding in the first place? What does it mean to be unique? There's a sense of better than here that's a real struggle. And genuinely, I mean, if you imagine a system of this sort, and I mean, I will tell you a little bit about the one we built, but it's actually not the focus of this talk. You can imagine that there's some sort of loop that's generating a whole bunch of artifacts, and then there's an object that has to actually compare them and decide which one optimizes some objective function. And what the heck goes into all of those categories is a completely legit question. Mike?
Well, I would say something, or a Northrop Frye's term, that has resonance with people who listen to it. It rings a bell you didn't expect to be wrong. And you go, yeah.
Okay, so I want to say that almost all of these comments we got from the audience focus on certain aspects of what I'm going to tell you are the 4 perspectives with capital P on creativity that I want you to think about. And those 4 perspectives, so this is an idea that dates back to Rhodes in the 60s, but in computational creativity, it's Anna Giordano's in her PhD thesis and the work around it that really made this sensitive to how we think about this in our community. And the idea is something is creative for basically 4 kinds of reasons. It's creative because the person who created it is somebody that we've decided is creative, which is a really unsatisfying thing, but at the end of the day is not so false for how we understand certain things, like everything Lady Gaga does is somehow supposed to be creative. It's the object itself, it's the inherent properties of the artifact itself that make it creative. It's the process we went through in creating that object that makes it creative. The steps that the fact that we followed the process of a particular school of creativity or a particular school of design's expectations, and a lot of you were in some sense focusing on this one, it's the people who consume it and their understanding of that object. It's the way it establishes an emotional response either in a community, among experts, or in general how human beings respond to that artifact. And those 4 different perspectives are really provide a lot of diverse opinions of what it means to satisfy the goal of being creative. In other words, one way in which that can be relevant is number 2 is the one where quite often you would imagine you'd be talking about quality of artifact, like this is a good poem, whereas number 3 could be talking about the way this poem was created is authentic and true to the process of generating poetry. And you can imagine that a system was actually focusing on that, or on how the audience responded to the system, or to the artifacts, rather than, I made a good poem. Survey that Charlie and Carolyn and I put together here at the bottom, I heartily encourage you to read. The person one is probably the most interesting for its not usefulness in the computational creativity domain, because normally we don't really care very much about saying that program over there is a creative program. On the other hand, one thing that we have to start being a lot more prepared for as we move into future decades is the question of who's culpable for the artifacts of one of these systems. If it, for example, makes hate speech or plagiarizes or something like that, somebody's vulnerable to a lawsuit. Who is that? And that's an interesting thing, particularly because a lot of these programs collaborate in quotation marks with systems that they themselves discover on the internet. And so there could be some grossness that results from that, and it's not entirely clear how that liability works. But otherwise, again, these perspectives on what's going on here have to do with is it a good artifact? Is it correctly created appropriately in the discipline, or is it actually influencing the community in question? And so to give you a little bit more sense of sort of how this plays out, we did a study where we took a bunch of poems that were actually generated by human beings and asked people, we used metrics that had been derived to assess the quality of poems, and we showed those poems to human beings, asked them to assess the poems using these desiderata, and wanted to sort of figure out, like, can human beings tell the difference between what we would call good poetry and bad poetry? And of course, we've already talked about how that's complicated. And maybe some of these ways of looking for what it means to be successful would or wouldn't show up as being as working. And so the study, to be a little bit more specific, the study was, we took some proposed metrics for computational creativity from the literature. We showed poems that we called good poems and bad poems to human beings on a crowdsourcing site. And we had the hypothesis that some of these metrics would be able to separate good poems from bad. And with Byron's comment in mind, here's an example of each. And to be specific, the good poem on the left was published in Poetry Magazine. If you're an English language poem, that's where you want to put a poem. If you're the ones on the right, we scraped a newbie forum in an online poetry website, and we specifically excluded any poems that had positive comments. So I feel confident saying that's not very good. But on the other hand, it has to be said that a lot of our reviewers of this paper objected to that claim. And then, of course, so did the actual participants in the study. Which is to say, we showed these poems to the good poems and the bad poems, and the hypothesis was that maybe these people on the internet would say that the good poems were more novel, more skillful, showed better imagery, and in every case they liked the bad poems better. This was our first negative result. It's not the last one. And part of what we learned from that project was, oh dear, we need to worry a lot more than we already were about who the audience was. This question of press, this question of not just the highfalutin things like Mike suggested about resonance and emotional salience, but actually the low level, whose opinion do we care about? The real press question. And so then we ran a study where we focused on experts. And we modeled this, we did this using a system called the consensual assessment technique. In that system, it's basically modeled on art juries. You take a collection of experts or quasi-experts, you put them in a room, you show them a bunch of artifacts from the type, and you say, rank these from really good to really terrible, use the whole ranking scheme, don't talk to each other, so in that sense they're not like an art jury. But otherwise, the model is do something that is very much like an art jury. And we use people, it's a Waterloo English department program in experimental digital media, it's a master's program. We use them as our participants. And then we could start to actually assess what was and wasn't a good computationally generated poem. And the outcome of that experiment was, more than anything actually, this collection of desiderata that we would like to satisfy from at least the product point of view in saying, hey, this is a good poem. And if you look at this list, it's actually not too bad. And we generated that by actually talking to human beings about what they did and didn't like about computationally generated poems. Now, this is a somewhat odd PhD thesis. Because so far I've told you about multiple studies and papers my student and I and Charlie wrote, and not one of them includes a single, the only lines of code we've so far written are statistical analysis. And I want to just take a quick moment, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about actual computational systems. I want to take a couple of minutes talking about why that is, and in part that's because the student in question is not a typical student. And in particular, last October, or last June rather, 4 months ago, we had the amazing fact that in the same week she convocated and published her first novel under a pen name with Angry Robot Press. And so having I want to, as one suggestion in this talk, and I mean this really seriously, think diversely about who your students are, because if they're different and unusual and not like the norm, you might get neat outcomes. This has been a pretty good example of that. She's nowadays, I mean, not that she's completely abandoned our world, she teaches at part-time at Queens these days, in addition to writing her second novel. So, and now I want to talk a little bit about our own actual system in this domain. This didn't work very well, and so that's part of why it's a smaller part of the talk. And genuinely, the intellectual contribution about thinking about what the goals are in this kind of project are the real bulk of the work. Nonetheless, we did build our own computational poetry system. It's not very good at writing actual poetry, but it uses really good techniques in doing that poetry. Yeah. And the idea of it was we wanted to model Calvin Trillin. Calvin Trillin is an American humorist, and every 2 weeks in The Nation, he writes a short, he's called their deadline poet. He writes a short poem based on things in the news. This is the one for last week, about yet another mass shooting in the US and the lack of response by most politicians in the US to that. We wanted to do something similar, where inspired by current news events, it generates a poem that's apropos whatever is going on in the news. And we wanted to do this, we also were inspired by some movements in art around found art, where the idea was we will take ideas from, or we will take raw material from the internet and collect it together, rather than having the system generate all of its own things itself. And so the idea was, and we called this program Twit Song, and the idea was we would collect tweets on a particular topic, put them into rhyming pairs, because I had this existing work on rhyme that I had done about 10 years ago with a grad student who is a psychiatrist. It's a weird world. Put them into sets of rhymes, identify whether they're relevant to the topic in question, how they feel, whether they use concrete imagery or not, and then assemble those into poems and ask human beings to assess them. We did this, a weird thing also about this is that this was work, of course, we did quite a long time ago, and it was before we had started to actually think about, much more thoughtfully about what makes a good poem and how do we get there. On the other hand, it still doesn't do such a bad job. This is sort of an example of one of the lines from one of the sonnets we generate, or one of the stanzas from one of the sonnets we generate. The lines are written by human beings, and then all of the work we're doing is topicality verification, and then assembling them into good sonnets of this sort. And it does okay. But the bulk of the work here is actually being done by the human beings, not us. In particular, it's human beings who are assessing whether the tweets are topical or have imagery in them. So about a year later or so, we did another version of the same sort of project where we tried to automate out more of the steps. We used computer techniques to identify whether the tweets were topical, whether they, we tried to basically go towards the 4 roles we found in our previous study with human beings to identify things that would make better poems. And then we assembled them into poems like 4, asked human beings to assess them, and we wound up writing a paper that is kind of satisfying when you can actually publish a paper that has the phrase "a negative result" in it. But on the other hand, the poems we generated that way didn't do any better than the poems we generated without trying to optimize for craft or novelty or meaning or emotion. And here's an example of one of the stanzas from one of those poems. And at the end of the day, that's kind of not very satisfying. And it's supposed to be have more imagery than maybe another poem of this sort might, possibly because it uses phrases like visually stunning or amazing or costume. But just having those little bits of value, it doesn't get you very much. So when we did the study and we used experts on the internet to compare poems that had been optimized in this way to poems that hadn't, they basically couldn't tell the difference and didn't like one or the other one. So, oh well. And so then as PhDs come to a close, the student needs to actually have a third thing to say that she's done, not just round 1 or round 2, but also round 3. So toward the beginning of last year, of 2018, we said, okay, what we really want to focus on is not so much, again, on the quality of the poem that results. We want to focus on the process of generating poetry. We want to model this on how people actually write poetry, not because that's the way computers should write poetry, but actually is an artistic choice. And so we generated a system that was supposed to not just pick tweets that were created by human beings and assemble them, but actually tries to find the place in a poem that doesn't work and fix it. The idea was to call this an editorial algorithm. So if you imagine that you're writing a poem, the way that you typically do that is you draft one out, and then you cross off the places where there aren't things you like, and you rewrite that line, and you X out this one, and you rewrite that line. And so the idea was to do something kind of like the same thing, where we focused on our 4 goals for a poem, that it's of high quality in craft, that it actually means something, that it generates an emotional response in the reader, and that it's new and different. And we tried to find the places in the poems that we were generating that least satisfied this goal, and then cross them out, and then try to edit and try to fix that problem. Now the problem when you do that naively is, and in this case, rather than trying to make sonnets as we had been in earlier programs, here we actually tried to make 4-line poems that are basically in the rhythm of Amazing Grace or the theme song for Gilligan's Island, which are actually the same. The idea, and so a problem if you just take the words that don't fit, cross them off, and replace them with strongly emotional or strongly salient words. One of the poems that we got out of that when we fed it a corpus of Bernie Sanders campaign speeches generated lines like "let wall street" and wall street, which is kind of satisfying from a aesthetic point of view, and this arts thing is sort of okay, but isn't really what we wanted in the first place. So instead we wound up, and this is a place that caused some problems afterwards, we find the word that is least optimal for our objective functions that we're looking to optimize, we cross it off, we cross the rest of the line off, and then we regenerate that line in what turns out to be an essentially Markovian fashion, and that doesn't work very well. So the process, again, the goal of this process, or the goal of this project was to have a high quality process of creating poems. And so we generate common meter quatrains. We used articles from the news corpus, or as I said, from political speeches. We did generate some poems using text from the current American president, but those were depressing. We picked a relevant emotion for the poem and tried to optimize for that emotion based on sort of how the news about a topic makes you feel, disgusted, enthusiastic, joyful, and so on. And then we did this sort of local optimization until it generates a poem. Most of these not very satisfying. And then in this particular case, we took unoptimized poems and optimized poems and compared them against each other. And we used experts that we found on the internet, because Carolyn's a published poet, among other things, to do the analysis of whether this worked. And unfortunately, the poems themselves aren't very, very satisfying. The first one's really bad. You can tell what it's from, and even, the bottom one is kind of more satisfying in terms of how it starts to feel like it's there's some sense of emotional salience to it perhaps, but not really. This is the kind of outcome of it. And the real problem, if you look at these poems, is not so much, it is mostly that what we optimized for by accident was incoherence. And we optimized for incoherence because when we looked for a word to fix and then corrected everything after it, what happens as a result of it is you get these Markov babbling at the end of the sentences. And that's not very, at the end of the lines, and that's not very satisfying. So nonetheless, so there's a basic problem here, which is that these aren't very satisfying as poetry objects. They don't make very much sense. And if we go back to that set of goals for what it means to be a poet, I think a thing that we almost take for granted, it didn't come up very much in the audience presentation, is coherence. Like, it has to just work together as a common thread. It has to not feel like it's a total mess. Unfortunately, these kind of are. Nonetheless, ironically enough, despite that, they actually are, the poems that are optimized in this way actually beat out the ones that aren't, 60% of the time, which was a kind of a surprise to us that despite their sort of incoherence, they do okay that way. So what do we learn from this at the end of the day? These are our goals for a poem. This is one of the actually products of Carolyn's thesis is this collection of goals which are now being used by other computational poetry system designers as things to look forward to and to assess their work on, which sort of does go to Byron's question, although not really. It turns out, and in some sense this is the unsurprising outcome of all of this, the hardest of all of this set, and the real challenge, and this is even true at the state of the art in this domain right now, which is certainly not what we've built. The hardest thing is genuinely getting computationally created systems to make something that means something. So it's a strange talk, which we've now come to the end to. And what I want to just hope that you've gotten out of this talk, in addition to gosh, Dan works on weird things, it's fine, is the idea that this is actually a domain that's worth thinking about. The question of are the artifacts that are the systems we're building in AI, what are they being used for? One of the things human beings really want to be is creative. One of the things we really want to do is in our relationships with our loved ones, make them things that show them how much we love them. And computers assist us in a whole bunch of tasks in our day-to-day lives, and they certainly help with that task too. I mean, you make a video for a proposal or something like that. But this question of genuinely taking a collaboration between a computer that is capable of generating complicated things and a human being that is capable of generating emotions, that's actually a potential space that has the potential to make our experience as human beings much better going forward. I hope this idea of what it means to be creative, focusing not just on the artifact or the process or how it makes you feel, but an ensemble of those and the person that made the artifact is useful to you. It's important to actually have goals for a specific domain when you're studying creativity, and it's hard to make a computational one as well. Thank you.
So are there any questions for Ken? Yes.
So, I thought the talk was really interesting, and this whole idea of what creativity is fascinating. Do you think that the question is easier if you, instead of asking for a creative poem, you ask for a creative program?
Yeah, that's a good question. So asking, the question is creative poems versus creative programs. So of course, your field includes things around automatic generation of codes. And as I said before, people from the theorem-proving world have actually started to enter this space too, and assign, with the aesthetic goal of getting good automatically proven theorems. I mean, the one thing that would be interesting would be, and I'm not a software engineer, obviously, would be if somebody in your field has done the parallel study to the one that gave us this. And that would give you, because part of the question is, what does it mean to be creative code? This gives you a list of things that you look for in creative poetry. I think the answer to your question, though, in general, is probably those are comparable. I mean, they're very structured. There's still a range for novelty. People are still expected to see weird things. It needs to compile. I don't know. Yeah.
So, I guess I'm comparing this to things I understand have been done in practical domains. Like, one of my favorites is a program that generates sports reporting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that some of this work exposes that human beings are not really as creative as we think we are. And
Right.
If you look at sports reporting, say there's a clear scenario, which is a game,
right,
and there's events that occur. There's just a finite number of them. There's a finite number of events in terms of sports report is used, and you can expose that out in a program and produce things that people can't tell the difference between.
And that's a while now. I mean, that goes back 10 years now, that both sports reporting has been automated in the way that you described, and also like reporting on company annual statements is another one that like those are, you know, such and such company reported its quarterly earnings, blah, blah, blah. Like the human being used to write those, and nowadays a lot of those are written by AI.
So I guess what I'm trying to understand is that, you know, there's one effort which you might view practical, but it also exposes that there's a false creativity. We think we're being creative, but there's a high degree of algorithm behind it. If you look at musical styles, now
Same
if you
thing.
apply this to poetry, is say, well, if I want to expose that there's nowhere near the creativity as clowns think they have, to say, well, how many different themes are there to poems? How many different types of poems are there? And then what are the range of possibilities to map onto these scenarios? And I wonder if you took that approach to say, let's expose the non-creativity, because not really algorithms behind this that become very close.
So I want to go in two directions with an answer to that question, because it's a very important question, sort of on two fronts. One is, despite, and you're right, a lot of business and sports reporting being astonishingly algorithmic, it is still the case that great sports writing still exists. And the reason why I want to highlight that is because we often assume that because
They're better than what's computer.
yes, but it's also of a very different kind. So if you look at somebody like John Doyle, who writes for the Globe and Mail, and his astonishing love of soccer, you get something kind of different out of that than you do out of just the ordinary.
Has that ever been evaluated?
Yeah. I mean, not in the way that we would consider satisfying, but like journalists give awards in their fields. But the other thing that I want to say is, I mean, and that actually is like relevant, because part of understanding quality is saying, in this domain, is this perceived by experts in this domain?
Well, but I think that's part of the question of exposing the lack of creativity. To say, you replace John Doyle with a program, does anybody actually know this?
Yeah. So at this point, but the other reason why this is a little bit less of a triviality of the question, like this question is harder than even you might think, is all of the AI systems that are genuinely at this point generating things that are indistinguishable from human beings in domains more complicated than sports writing or news or business news are starting off with corpora of such astonishing breadth and diversity that it's a little bit arch to say, I mean, I don't have access to billions of pieces of text because I physically read them. And so it's a little bit strange to say that there's a lack of creativity in a system that has access to every single sentence that's ever been published. There's some challenge there in the ability that these astonishing AI systems have to model language in ways that are partially based on the fact that their input is more than human beings can hear in 10 lifetimes. So there's some things to think about there too. But your point is at least your point is still well taken.
Novel writers, the classic line is you should read a lot so you can write, right? So this is again data gathering so that they're training their algorithms to write. And
Right.
You see the same thing with music composition, where it composes things to be 10 scholars.
Oh, absolutely. That's been true for 10 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
It's a challenge. I will say though that in my lifetime I will probably read, and I read an astonishingly large amount compared to most people. I will probably read a few tens of thousands of books in my lifetime, and a computer can generate, or a computer can at this point start off with a corpus that is millions of books, and that genuinely is a little bit different as the input to that creative process when it's